Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second talk of Discover Islam Week 2021. We have an amazing talk lined up for you today, which we organized in collaboration with the Islamic Diversity Center. But before we start, I want to give a very quick word about Discover Islam Week. So for those of you who don't know, Discover Islam Week is always one of the biggest events on campus. We set up a huge marquee where we invite hundreds of guests to see the displays and talk to our volunteers about Islam, as well as take part in numerous activities. This year, we've organized an online program of talks and events. If you missed yesterday's talk, you can watch it on our YouTube or Facebook pages. We have further talks coming up discussing mental health and women in Islam. There will also be a quiz available on Friday from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. You can drop into the Zoom call at any point to take a shot at the quiz and drop out whenever you would like to. And at the end, we'll send prizes to the top scorers. Additionally, there will be a fun ladies-only event next Monday, all about the hijab, and there will be more prizes to win there. You can find more info about all of this on our social media, so do make sure to follow us on there. And now, on to the main event of today. I would like to welcome our respected speaker, Brother Subboor Ahmad. He will be talking today about Islam, atheism, and evolution. At any point during the talk, you can send your questions using the link shown here on the screen, and our speaker will answer some of them at the end. So if you have any questions, at the end, there will be an opportunity for you to pose these questions to the speaker. So now let's all welcome Brother Subboor onto the stage. Welcome, brother.
Jazakallah khair for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So this particular topic, I usually break it down into, where's the host gone? I like to have a conversation. Unless, I don't know, do you do this like a conversation or do you do it like face to camera? How do you do it?
So if you have a talk, prepared, you can go through that, but
okay, fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so I'm guessing you're going to come in around the last 15 minutes just for questions and stuff, like 10, 15 minutes. All right, okay, that's brilliant. Let's start. Okay, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. Thank you for setting up this talk. I'd like to thank Newcastle FM, Fast FM, Newcastle is ISoc, and everybody else involved who I haven't mentioned, including all of the, of course, volunteers who've helped set this up. All right, so let's start off on the obvious question. Why are we talking about this topic? Why aren't we talking about God, Islam, and string theory? Right? Why is that not of any more importance than this topic? Why is this topic supposedly more important? I think that's a good point to begin on, because we want to know what's the point. Why is this topic so hotly debated? Why is this something that is politically charged? Why is a scientific theory, such that it's even had discussions at an international level with countries discussing about whether it should be taught or not, and other sort of agreements in which countries have to agree to teaching it and whatnot. So what's going on? So I think a good way to begin is by looking at the broader picture, which is essentially to do with the worldview of atheism. Now, Richard Dawkins, in his 1980s book, The Blind Watchmaker, he puts it in the following way. Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists, right? So there's obviously something about Darwinian evolution which gives an intellectual grounding, some sort of bedrock, some foundational support to the atheist worldview. I think this is very important to point out right from the beginning. There's something there that undermines theism, which is why it is so important for atheists. I also want to point out that imagine if someone said string theory allows these group of people to be intellectually satisfied Taoists, right? That would be quite strange. It would be quite strange to hear that some scientific theory supports a worldview. Now, with Darwinian evolution, it is something which definitely plays a role within the materialistic, mechanistic, naturalistic worldview. In other words, the idea that there is no creator fits pretty well with the Darwinian worldview. Let's look at another thing that the most famous Darwinist in the world, Richard Dawkins, said. In a video which is quite popular online now, although I don't think that was his intention, he's never said this in any of his writings or any of his other lectures, but he did make this one slip up once, right? And then obviously people took it and they, like myself, we enjoyed, pushing it everywhere. What he basically said is this: evolution is something that you can believe in, and you can believe in God. They're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to give up one to believe in the other. However, because there's a general idea that in order to believe in evolution, you have to be an atheist, then what Dawkins says is, if I want people to become atheists, then the easiest way of doing that is simply showing them evolution's true, and I can turn them into atheists. So here, in other words, what he's saying is, there's a false belief that you have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. There's a false belief that you have to believe in evolution, so you have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. So since his goal is to turn people into atheists, the easiest way to do that is by showing evolution's true. And now this starts to complete the picture for why the most famous book when it comes to the atheist literature, The God Delusion, the central argument of the God Delusion is in essence the idea that since design is an illusion because of our discovery of Darwinism, therefore God probably does not exist, right? That's the essential idea. So the main driving force of the book, the main upshot of the central argument, which he has, quite clearly laid out in steps, which you find around, page 156, 157. I know this on the top of my head simply because so many times I've had to reference this, right? So he makes it clear, he puts it in a logical form, right? The argument, even though philosophically it's a poor argument, right? It is really quite shabby, but still he puts it in a form, a logical form that can be analyzed, right? And there he makes it clear that it undermines theism. So clearly there's something about this theory which is more than it's just a theory, right? Another thing to keep in mind before we get into the journey, because the way this talk is going to work, inshallah, God willing, is that we're first going to be covering an introduction. After the introduction, we're going to be covering the philosophy of science. After the philosophy of science, we're going to be covering the science of Darwinism, right? And lastly, we're going to be covering Darwinism as religion. But I think the introduction is good from the perspective that helps us see the wider picture before we zoom in and we deal with the issue. So now what we'll do is we'll get into the actual philosophy, right? Now, before we speak about the philosophy of Darwinism, the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of science, I think it's very important, extremely important, to get something out of the way first, get the elephant out of the room. Someone may say, well, if you want to understand Darwinism, why on earth would you study philosophy? Why would you look at the philosophy of biology? What on earth is the philosophy of biology? In fact, some atheists would just completely mock even the idea of there being a field known as philosophy of biology. And in fact, generally the philosophy of science is pretty much not only neglected, I would say actively downplayed by many atheist activists. They would just not take it that seriously. Okay, now with the topic of philosophy of biology, philosophy of science, and how it relates to science, a good way of thinking about it is this. A biologist would be studying organisms. A biologist would be staring at bacteria or a bunch of crows or elephants or grass or whatever. That's the object of study for a biologist. A biologist is going to be staring and looking at the behavior of animals or insects or microorganisms or whatever it is. Now, what does a philosopher of biology do? What does a philosopher of science do? What they do is actually their object of study is not the actual biological specimens that the biologist is looking at. For them, their object of study is the biologist and the scientist themselves. So while the scientist is staring at a bunch of chimpanzees, the philosopher is staring at a bunch of scientists and he's studying their behavior. He's like, how do they come to conclusions? What are their premises? What are their axioms? What are the hidden premises which are not there? What are the sub-assumptions which are there? What is the paradigm with which they're looking at it? How are they taking anomalous data and helping it to actually fit within the existing theory, or are they actually going through a paradigm shift? What is going on? So it is literally the equivalent of somebody walking along a pavement, right? And they see a street in front of them, then they turn left and they say they're central London and there's like a maze and they're just walking around. And that's like the scientists, right? They're looking at what's right in front of their noses. They're looking at what's in front of them. And above the city, you have a helicopter and you have somebody in the helicopter staring down at that person, looking at how that person is making decisions and where they're headed and what paradigm they have. That's essentially the philosopher. So that's why the philosophy of science in relation to this topic is far more important than somebody who just comes here and speaks and who just has a scientific background, because they will come from a background that is impoverished. They will come from a very blinkered view. They will not get the bigger picture. And there is a great deal of science that philosophers of science have to read. They have to study. They have to, the only thing philosophers of science would not do is research themselves. But they would definitely read all of the literature which is relevant to their field in the same manner that an active scientist would, right? So that's why the philosophy of science is important here. Now, what are some of the things that the philosophy of science can teach us? And by the way, I'm looking at the comment section now. If there's something that looks kind of relevant, I'll ask Sahel to pin it on the screen so I can address that, inshallah. Okay, so let's dive into the philosophy of science. What does the philosophy of science teach us? The first thing the philosophy of science teaches us from the broad perspective is that science does not lead to atheism. Science does not actually support philosophical naturalism. Now, philosophical naturalism sounds like a heavy word. I'm going to kind of just simplify it to the idea that there is nothing beyond the natural. There's and obviously that means there's no God. So there's no soul, there's no angels, there's no immaterial mind. Everything is natural, essentially, right? So science, the first thing that we understand from the philosophy of science is that science doesn't give evidence to, does not support philosophical naturalism, right? Science from that perspective can be a very useful way of looking at the world, a very useful tool for people who believe in God or people who don't believe in God, right? It it doesn't really matter whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God. You can be equally as effective when it comes to your role as a scientist. And the field of science doesn't lead to atheism, right? That's a complete nonsensical argument, which you often find some atheist activists, apologists using. Okay, so we get the general idea that science does not lead to atheism. So that's pretty clear. The other thing to keep in mind that we learn from the philosophy of science is that science is based on something known as methodological naturalism. Okay, methodological naturalism. Naturalism, like I defined it, or philosophical naturalism, which is another way of saying it, is basically, for lack of getting into, to avoid getting into semantical differences, is basically atheism, right? So methodological naturalism is simply the idea that as a methodology, we're going to do science with the assumption that there is no non-natural causes, there is no God, there is no soul, there's none of these things. So when you're looking at a scientific explanation for something, you only stick to naturalistic explanations. That's known as methodological naturalism. Okay. However, this is in stark contrast to philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is the idea that there is basically no God. The universe is all that there is. All that we have is nature. So methodological naturalist, they can be a theist or they can be an atheist, right? And, I don't want to get into the history of methodological naturalism, when it came about and whether it's valid or not. I've had discussions on my channel with people on this in the past, and that itself can be like an entire hour-long discussion. So that's what we understand, that science does not lead to philosophical naturalism, although science itself runs on this thing known as methodological naturalism. Okay. Another thing we understand from the philosophy of science is that science does not give us certainty. Okay? Science does not give us certainty. Okay, there's an interesting comment here. If we relied only on the Quran as a source of assumed knowledge, there would be no advances in logical thinking and thus scientific discovery. So this particular comment, I would 100% agree with it. I would say you're totally correct. If we relied on the Quran as a source of assumed knowledge, there would be no advances in logical thinking and thus scientific inquiry, right? What you're saying here, my friend, self-law, is 100% correct. However, there is no Muslim who can justify that statement. We in Islam do not believe the Quran is the only source of assumed knowledge. And I want to put it this way. If I take your statement and I replace it with, and this is, by the way, perfectly related to the topic of philosophy of science, right? If I take your statement and say, if we only relied on the origin of species as a source of assumed knowledge, there would be no advances in logical thinking and scientific discovery. That's true as well. However, no scientist would say the origin of species is the only source of assumed knowledge. So I'm not saying you're making this argument, but I'm saying that statement, or these type of statements, these are actually used, and these are basically a straw man fallacy, right? This is a straw man fallacy. I'm not saying you're making it. I'm saying these arguments which I use, these are straw man fallacies. Because what you do is you make up a fake argument, a weak argument, then you knock it down, and then you're like, okay, there you go. We have success. The problem is, of course, that this is not a valid argument at all. Okay, another thing to keep in mind. So when it comes to the philosophy of science, science doesn't lead to certainty. This is something that is well understood within the philosophy of science. Science is not there to give you absolute knowledge. Science is not there to give you proof. Science is there to give you workable theories which can change, which is why as Muslims we can accept Darwinism as a working theory, as the generally accepted idea. However, we will not say it's absolutely true. And people think when you call something scientific, it means you're saying it's true. No, you're not. You're simply saying it's scientific. Okay. Another reason that we really need to question this whole idea of just using, science is that even the way these philosophical concepts are put forward, and remember, guys, maybe some of you don't know this, maybe some of you do, science branched out from philosophy, right? Even historically. So Darwin was not called an evolutionary biologist. Darwin was called a natural philosopher, because science and philosophy were sort of the one thing. You essentially just had natural philosophers, and then it split off into science and philosophy of science. So the philosophy of science teaches us a few very interesting and powerful concepts. The first is that scientific conclusions are based upon induction. They're based upon induction. Now, you may be wondering, what is induction? Induction is the idea that you take a limited set of observations, and from them you make a general conclusion. I have seen 100 white swans as a scientist. Therefore, the next one that I will see is going to be white. That's a type of induction. You're going from what you've seen to a particular conclusion about the future. Or I have seen 1,000 white swans, therefore all swans are white. This is induction. You're going from a limited set of observations, whether that's 1 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000, to universal. But then with this induction, you have something known as the problem of induction, which was raised by, people throughout history, but most notably David Hume, the Scottish philosopher. So in essence, the issue is you may come across a black swan, right? And then no matter how many swans you've seen in the past, your theory that all swans are white can be challenged. So this is known as the problem of induction. The problem of induction is there to teach us that no matter how well confirmed a scientific theory is, it can still be proven wrong in the future. Secondly, another problem in the philosophy of science for the people who are claiming science gives us certainty is actually the problem of underdetermination. Underdetermination. Okay. So let's break down this word underdetermination. Determination is pretty clear. You are determined. You know what the result is. That's determined. So I'll give you an example. You are given £5, right? You're given £5, and from these pounds, you are supposed to buy, you are told you can go and buy 3 oranges and 2 apples, and the 3 oranges are £1 each, and the 2 apples are £1 each as well. So you are determined from the perspective that if I give you a £5 note, you go to the market, you're going to get 3 oranges, you're going to get 2 apples. It's pretty clear what you're going to do. You are determined from that perspective. Underdetermination is if I give you £5, right, and I give a whole bunch of people £5 in, say, this is set up by Newcastle ISoc, so say Newcastle Town Centre. I give everybody £5, and we all go out, and I say to them, apples are £1, oranges are £1. Buy apples and oranges with your £5. I don't tell you how much to get. Some people will come back with 1 orange and 4 apples. Some people will come back with 2 oranges and 3 apples. Some people will come back with, 1 apple and 4 oranges. Somebody may go and just buy a pomo and not do. Pomo is a really nice thing, by the way, just as a side note. It's anybody who's in the Newcastle, Middlesbrough area. It's a delicacy. Yes, just salvating on that thought. Anyway, so you are underdetermined. You are underdetermined by me giving you £5 and telling you get you can buy apples and oranges without giving you the amounts. Everybody will come back with something different. Okay, people will come back with totally different things. So this is underdetermination. If I know people in a town center have been given £5 and they're told to buy apples and oranges, then I know it is underdetermined what the result is, because it can be a whole bunch of things. So the problem of underdetermination is a problem in the philosophy of science. And the problem is the same data can give rise to different conclusions. The same data can be used to come up with alternative theories. This is not something that was even unknown at the time of Darwin, even though the philosophy of science as a general area of inquiry did exist, but it didn't exist as a separate field. He actually, in The Origin of Species, he makes it clear that you can use the facts in my book to come up with an alternative different to mine. But he says, he obviously believes his to be correct. So Jim Hales is saying evolution by natural selection is the best explanation for the diversity of life we see. Now, Jim, thank you for joining us on this live stream. Now, even if your statement, we were to accept it without challenging it, without looking at the alternatives that are available, we could still say that doesn't mean it's true. So evolution by natural selection is the best explanation for the diversity of life we see. Okay, let me replace this statement going back 100 years. Newtonian mechanics is the best explanation for the physical phenomena that we see. That's something that people would have said in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. In fact, the Newtonian worldview worked well for well over 200 years. If you made a prediction, where's this planet going to be in 6 months from now, it would be there, according to the Newtonian worldview. But it turned out to be wrong. It turned out his assumptions about time and space were wrong as well, with the Einsteinian revolution. So even if your statement was correct, it's a non sequitur if you want to. I'm not saying you are, but if you want to go to the conclusion that therefore it's true, right? So something working doesn't mean it's true. So the problem of underdetermination, another way of thinking about it is think about a scatter graph. So you get a y-axis, you get an x-axis, you get random dots. How many lines of best fit can you make? Well, you can have many different ones, but obviously as scientists, they have to decide upon one, the best explanation. So that's the problem of underdetermination. A third issue in the philosophy of science is theory-ladenness, right? So how theories color you actually looking at the data. Now, I just realized that we're nearly halfway into the talk and I'm still on the first part and we've got another 2 parts. So I'm going to try and speed this up a little bit. But the philosophy of science, I usually spend longer on because that's the most important thing. In fact, after the philosophy of science, it's irrelevant whether you listen to the scientific part or the part about Darwinism as a religion, because that sorts the issue. Science doesn't undermine God. Evolutionary theory does not undermine theism, and it's not, you can't say it's true literally, right? You can't say Darwinism or any other evolutionary theory is true literally. Okay, so you have the theory-ladenness. Another problem that we have in the philosophy of science is problem of unconceived alternatives. That there may be alternatives which exist, which we cannot even conceive of at the time, such as there was anomalous data when it came to Newtonian worldview, but then they didn't have the idea of general relativity and time and space being flexible like, fabric. So they couldn't come up with that inference. Anyway, that's the philosophy of science section done. So what do we understand from that? Science doesn't give us certainty. Science doesn't give us absolute proof. Okay, so we get that. Darwinism is a scientific theory, but scientific theory does not mean it's true. It just means it's a valid scientific theory. Okay. Second point, the science of Darwinism. Now, somebody may say, look, whether we look at biochemistry, genetics, anatomy, physiology, linguistics, psychology, biogeography, paleontology, it's all leading to one conclusion, that Darwinism is the only game in town, it's the greatest show on earth, right? It's true. How could it be all these different scientific theories or subfields are leading all to the same conclusion? Even newer fields like, say, bioinformatics, even that's, dovetailing with Darwinism. Again, this is a very popular sort of propaganda for the lack of. I don't want to be, I don't want to be vague about this. There is direct propaganda when it comes to Darwinian theory. Most people don't know that even as recently as 2016, the Royal Society had a discussion. The Royal Society is the same place where Darwin published the theory in 1858, and then 1859 he published the book. They're in that very society. You have scientists that come, biologists that come, and they're literally asking the very same questions from 150 years earlier. Is Darwin even correct? So obviously this is just blatant propaganda. Now, there's a serious issue when it comes to this type of rhetoric. Not only is it that there's alternatives, which we'll speak about later, there's also something else very interesting, which is that no biologist can deny, no Darwinist can deny three things about Darwinian evolution. It is based on a probabilistic framework, it has assumptions, which has sub-assumptions, and there are disputes about its core ideas. Nobody can deny this. And I'm not saying in the religious circles or Christian scientists. I am saying in academic circles. And by the way, in Islam, it is forbidden to bet. But I have a wager. Every single skeptic out there, atheist out there, whoever you are, if you can prove to me that there is a science of Darwinism which is outside of the three things that I mentioned, which is the probabilistic framework, the assumptions, and the disputes, then I will give up. I will say, okay, no more YouTube, no more books, no more writings, no more lectures, no more talks. I'm going to go inside a cave and just start doing Uber Eats and just ordering palm oil all day and just dying of diabetes. I'm willing to do that. Islam obviously forbids suicide, but I'm just saying I'll just pig out on palm oil and just keel over, right? I'm willing to, just say something ridiculous like that. Because it just doesn't make any sense. It's everywhere. You find this everywhere. How could it not be? It's based on a probabilistic framework when 99.999% of species are undiscovered. That's according to the National Science Foundation. Of course, it's based on a probabilistic framework. All of our understanding of current theory is based upon 0.0001% of the data, because vast majority of life that existed, it lived, it died, is gone, is finished. So, of course, it's going to be based on a probabilistic framework. Secondly, there's assumptions. The obvious assumption that Darwin speaks about is gradualism, which has been under massive amount of strain. His idea was things evolve gradually. We now have punctuated equilibrium. We now have evolution at scales which doesn't really make sense from a Darwinian point of view. We also have the assumption that you have random mutations, copying errors, right, which over time are the fodder which is used by natural selection to create body plans and to create all of the diversity that we see. That's a massive assumption. And that is something which is incredibly difficult to try and show. In fact, when you ask people for evidence of Darwinian evolution, they just give you evidence of evolution. They just give you evidence that bacteria evolve, or the peppered moth example, or whatever. The evolution that was known before Darwin, right? Even before Lamarck, right? that evolution that was known by the Greeks and the people of the Indus civilization and the Babylonians and others and Chinese. Who cares, right? We're talking about Darwin. Darwin came 150 years ago. His theory of Darwinian evolution is totally different to the general idea of evolution, which no one should really have a problem with. Species change. You have speciation. You have adaptation. What's the big deal? Okay. So we have the assumptions like gradualism and also natural selection, but also genes are only transmitted vertically. We now have knowledge of horizontal gene transfer. What are some of the other assumptions off the top of my head without getting too bogged down in details? Well, I skip my mind. But anyway, you've got multiple assumptions. This is not unknown. This is clear, right? This is like, it's gonna be so hard for someone to try and deny. I mean, oh yes, it just came to mind. Acquired characteristics are not inherited, meaning if you start doing something which is substantial in your life, like you start going to the gym and you become super fit and healthy, or may God protect you, you happen to be in an area where there's a famine and then you live through long periods of starvation, like that, those acquired traits, such as the effect on your metabolism or your stress or your muscles that you acquire in your life, they can't be inherited. That's false. We now know that Darwinian assumption is false. You do have the acquirance of, you do have the vertical inheritance. Your children do inherit those acquired traits, right? They actually do. And that's, again, something that does not fit the Darwinian picture. And of course, there's disputes. And the disputes not only being the efficacy of natural selection, the disputes being substantial things such as, natural genetic engineering as an alternative, or evolution by self-organization, or neo-Lamarckian evolution, or mutation-driven evolution. All of these alternatives that some biologists are pushing out. You can go to the third way of evolution. You can find that when it comes to the Darwinian mechanism, not to universal common ancestry, when it comes to the Darwinian mechanism, they're saying this doesn't make any sense. Likewise, there's massive disputes when it comes to homology. We have homoplasy. We have at the genetic level, homology is the idea that similarities at genetic or anatomical level are due to common ancestry, but that's obviously just an assumption. Even on its own, it's just an assumption, even if there's no anomalies. But we have anomalies. We have genetic data and anatomical data, which is not due to common ancestry, right? So that's probabilistic framework assumptions disputes. That's clear. Okay, good. It's good. We're about to hit the 40-minute mark. So now it's time to bring in the Darwinism as a religion and then try and address some of the questions. Okay, and also, Sohail, if there's something that you find interesting, we've got 20-something minutes left, so I think it's good. Maybe I can just start answering those questions as well as I'm doing the Darwinism as religion section. Okay, now it sounds odd. It sounds odd that Darwinism, and by the way, Sister Rahima is saying, can't Darwinism and religion coexist? Very good question. What I would say to that is Darwinism is a religion. So it's not the case that can Darwinism and religion coexist. Darwinism is a religion. Now, if I say Darwinism is a religion, obviously some Darwinists are going to totally reject that. They're going to be like, that makes no sense. How is Darwinism a religion? Well, the first thing I would say is there's a massive difference when it comes to the popular understanding of evolutionary theory and the academic understanding. That's not only in terms of the science, but it's also in terms of the philosophical implications of the theory. I'm not the only one out there saying Darwinism is a religion. People before, like decades ago, have called out Darwinism as a religion. And these are people who believe in Darwinism. So let's go through a sort of chronology of who called it a religion. I thought I had my bag. I don't. But there's a very interesting book I wanted to pull out and start talking about. So Julian Huxley, he wrote a book in the 1940s called Darwinism as Religion. Now, Julian Huxley was an atheist, a philosopher, a biologist, a Darwinist, definitely not a friend of religion, but he says Darwinism is a developed religion. It is a non-revealed religion. It's a natural religion, and he believed the whole world should be indoctrinated, not indoctrinated in his words, but indoctrinated in my words. For him, they should start believing, the whole world should start believing in this Darwinian religion. He was the first president of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. It's a very powerful pulpit from which to push out these Darwinian propagandas. And he obviously believed in this is more than a theory. Later on, we get Michael Roos, 2016. He published a book with Oxford University. He's again another atheist like Julian Huxley. He's a philosopher of science. He is somebody who obviously does not have a religious bone in his body, but he is saying Darwinism from the very beginning till now is not just a scientific theory. There's obviously a scientific layer to it, but above and beyond that, it is also a religion, and it has functioned as an alternative to traditional religion since the time of Darwin. And his book, Darwinism as Religion, which is published by Oxford University nonetheless, right? It's not some religious creationist mouthpiece, actually admits this. Likewise, you have biologists, right? Lynn Margulis, who says history is going to remember Neo-Darwinism as a Anglo-Saxon religion, right? She's an atheist. She's a biologist. She's not a Darwinist. She's an evolutionist. That's what she says. She's passed away. She was the late wife of Carl Sagan, the famous atheist. Masato Shinai is still alive in Japan, an award-winning scientist. Again, not a religious bone in his body, a traditional religious bone, but he says Darwinism is Darwin is a god in biology. You can't challenge him, and he obviously doesn't believe in Darwinism. He believes in an alternative. Likewise, the other biologists who say the same thing. I mean, I could just go on and on. Look up the works of Thomas Nagel and James Shapiro and these guys talking about it. I mean, it's not worth even, if someone really wants to seriously argue Darwinism is not a religion, right? Then you might as well argue Islam's not a religion and Christianity is not a religion. You might as well argue religion doesn't exist. It's going to be very hard to define religion in a way that doesn't make Darwinism a religion. Unless you say, for a religion, you have to believe in God, which is not true, by the way. That's a common misconception. There's a common misconception that in order for you to believe in religion, you need to believe in something supernatural. You don't. Communism was a religion. Buddhism is a religion, but they don't believe in God, right? So yeah, this just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so Islam and Darwinism are essentially at theological war, and I don't say that lightly. Islam is saying the purpose of life is to worship a transcendent creator, and that's the only creator worthy worship. And I want everybody to realize this. Yeah, what does Islam say? Islam says in its basic tenet, the most important aspect of Islam, we have a statement which we say, and that statement is La ilaha illallah. We say there is none worthy of worship except Allah. Except Allah is the word that we use for the creator in Islam. So there is no deity, there is none worthy of worship except the deity, except the one true God, Allah. That is the purpose of life. That is Islam. Islam starts off on that. That is the very definition of Islam. What is the definition of the purpose of life when it comes to Darwinism? It's not that at all. It's the ultimate rationale of life, as Richard Dawkins says in The Selfish Gene, is survival and reproduction. That's the ultimate rationale of life, right? It's a pretty pathetic way of looking at the world. If you just, I mean, why don't people just go stand outside a sperm bank, right, and just donate the sperm? If the very purpose of your life is just that, why don't just eat palm oil all day and just go to the sperm bank? That's it. That's what you could do with your life, right? Just doesn't make any sense. Obviously, the Darwinists would try and explain human behavior through kin selection and reciprocal altruism and all these types of ways. But essentially, breaking down to his core bones, that's what it is. It's survival and reproduction. Islam says that there is a creator, right? But Darwinists, right? Even though Darwinian evolution does not undermine the existence of God, Darwinists, the most hardcore of the Darwinists, are militant atheists. And obviously the morals of the two worldviews are going to be wildly different. Even though Darwinists today, they're liberals, they're humanists, they're, kind people. It's almost like they are the equivalent of atheist Quakers, right? They wouldn't harm a fly. In fact, they don't want to breathe too much because, when they breathe, then microorganisms could, pass away and, this type of thing. That's the image they give. Well, that's not really what you should be living your life according to. If you are a true Darwinist, you should actually be similar to maybe perhaps Darwin, who believed that the white European civilization is going to wipe off the map all of the savages, right? Or Leonard Darwin, Darwin's son, who is better to understand Darwin than his own son, who believed one of the most difficult questions, and before I get into what he said, who was the father of eugenics in this country, right? Who said, what one of the most difficult questions in the future is what we're going to do with the savage races, right? So anyway, Darwinism itself is even the idea of natural selection and population and growth and all of this. Where did Darwin get his idea from? According to his own admission, he got it from an economist. He got it from Thomas Malthus. It's a capitalistic inspiration. It's not the case that Darwinism inspires capitalism. It's the case that capitalism allowed the intellectual grounding for Darwinism, and then Darwinism went back into a positive feedback loop, right? So, I mean, obviously there's a huge difference between the worldview of Darwinism and the actual way that Darwinists today, who are Quakers and humanists and liberals and kind and loving with, flowers in their hair and, dancing around their trees. Of course, we all know that's not really the way that Darwinists should be behaving. Okay, so Islam, and it has a particular paradigm, and the paradigm that we have is completely incompatible with the Darwinian paradigm. Another thing to keep in mind is that there may be aspects of science which go against the Quranic narrative. For example, the Quran says that a virgin gave birth. Now, we as Muslims, even though you find some Muslims today who would try and, maybe it's better I go through this question, because this question I can relate it to what I'm saying. Darwinism versus Adam from Quran, which has more evidence, which explains our nature. Okay. Now, the thing is, we would say that's a false dichotomy, right? We're not saying Darwinism or the Quran. We're saying Darwinism we can accept as a valid scientific theory, right? However, the Quran allows for miracles. And just like the miracle of Adam alayhi salam, Adam, peace be upon him, conflicts with Darwinian theory, the miracle of the birth given by a virgin conflicts with the general reproductive theories that we have, a male and a female, a sperm, egg, and so on and so forth. So even from a geological point of view, how is it possible, not geological point of view, actually, that's not the right field. But anyway, and someone who studies oceans, right, Maybe someone could put it in the comment section. Oceanographer, I don't know what. Would they agree with Moses parting the sea? Absolutely not. But do we believe it as Muslims? Absolutely we do, right? So we believe miracles are possible. Now, of course, according to from a purely scientific understanding, methodological naturalism, miracles don't exist, but we would say miracles do exist. Now, we would do an epistemic weighing. If the Quran says X, we believe in the Quran because of independent evidence. And if science says Y, we will accept that as a working theory, but we will not use that to change our beliefs. How I like to think about it is this. Darwinism is heavily overrated. There is a lot of propaganda. There is a lot of information which is put out which is false. There is a lot of misrepresentation. There is fallacies of equivocation and all these sorts of things that these Darwinists do. However, even if we look at it from a very cold, rational, objective point of view, the biggest conflict in the history of Islam and science is not evolutionary theory. It is really not. The biggest conflict that has ever happened between Islam and science is the idea that the universe is eternal, which was actually put forward by physicists who believe the universe is basically has no beginning, no end. And the evidence was pointing in that direction. The paradigm of the universe being eternal was used by scientists to operate in. Yet, until the 1940s, we had no scientific evidence that the Big Bang is the way that the universe came about. The idea that the universe has a beginning did not come about until the 1940s. So all of those years that scientists had a consensus, and of course with Darwinism by natural selection, evolution by natural selection, there is, we can definitely argue there isn't a consensus. All of the physicists are basically saying something, that the universe is eternal, and the Quran is saying the universe has a beginning. What would a Muslim do in the 1940s? A Muslim would say, we accept the eternal universe as a working scientific theory, but we don't accept it to be literally true because we have independent reasons why the Quran is true. Later on, we discovered that actually the Big Bang model is better, and therefore the universe has a beginning according to that, and that's in line with the Quran. 500 years from now, we may go back to some eternal universe idea, and the Big Bang may be completely discarded. We will not change our beliefs based upon something which is not true. We will accept it as a working model. And this is again, another straw man which atheists make, which is either this or that. It's either the Quran or science. No, we will accept science. We will accept it 100% as a working model. We will not deny it. We will not challenge it. We will not refuse to study it. We will work in the scientific laboratories. We will be at the forefront, the cutting edge of science. We will just not change our beliefs like no rational person would if you have higher epistemic weighing in terms of the Quran, right? And we know that, there can be U-turns, there can be paradigm shifts, there can be times where scientists completely do, completely discard a theory that they previously accepted. And I'd just like to add something which I didn't previously say. Even Richard Dawkins, even though despite he's the biggest Darwinist in the world, even in his lesser known book, A Devil's Chaplain, he says the same thing. We may discover facts in the future which will make us discard Darwinism or modify beyond recognition. So even he recognizes that problem from the philosophy of science, even though in his other works he doesn't seem to take that on board. So thank you for listening. That's basically it. Islam, atheism, and Darwinism. Darwin was definitely not an atheist. Darwin was somebody who believed in God most of his life. He was a deist until pretty much the last decade of his life. And he didn't think he didn't think it was right to equate Darwinism with atheism either. And he would have totally disagreed with these new atheists. But that's a different topic I can talk about another time. And a good book on that is Nick Spencer's Darwin and God, who, by the way, I'm trying to get an interview with him on my channel, inshallah, soon. At the moment, I haven't been able to confirm it yet, but maybe in the future, inshallah. So yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you very much, Brother Subboor. That was an excellent and very beneficial talk, alhamdulillah. Can you take a few more questions if possible?
Yes.
Would you be willing to take a bit more questions? Yeah?
Yeah, of course.
Right. So we have a question here. What is the difference between modern evolution by natural selection and al-Jahil hypothesis and that of the ancient Greeks?
It's a very good question. I would say Al-Jahiz is somebody I don't want to talk about simply because I thought I knew what he said. However, there's been a paradigm shift within academia, and that paradigm shift about Al-Jahiz and the works of even other Muslims who they say were pro-evolution, in that many of them were misrepresented. So I'm going to ignore that Al-Jahiz thing because the stuff I've read about him, I'm going to assume that is wrong now and it's outdated because Darwin's Ghosts is a book written by, forgotten her name, some woman, not some woman, it's an academic, but some serious academic, right? Even she gets it wrong because when I read about Al-Jahiz from her, again, it was giving the standard narrative and that turned out to be wrong. But anyway, so Darwin, his idea is that one form of life, the last universal common ancestor, some at the beginning of which we now assume to be about 4 billion years, that led to all this tree of life, and then you have all of these species going back to one universal common ancestor, and this happened through a naturalistic, not naturalistic, it happened through natural selection and working on random variations, and that was basically it. That was Darwin's idea. Now, the Greeks and the Babylonians and the Indians, and what did they believe? Well, they had many different ideas. Going back, some of them believed in multiple origins, some believed in one origin. Long story short, there wasn't a consensus, but the general idea that species change, the general idea that things go extinct, the general idea that there's biological change over time and there's adaptation, that was well known, well understood, and accepted by pretty much everyone. But Darwin came along to give something radically different in 1859, and we should never equate pre-Darwinian evolutionary ideas or the evidence for generally evolution with Darwinian evolution, because that would be the fallacy of equivocation.
Thank you very much. The next question here. When Subboor says limited observations or limited data, what does limited precisely mean in this context?
Limited means it is not infinite. So any number is going to be limited. Now, some people, when they think limited, that means the person doesn't have enough observations. That's the general idea. Your data is very limited. Okay, I'm going to go get more. The thing is, the philosophical way that I've explained it, that means no matter what data you have, it's always going to be limited. And that's why David Hume and others basically thought science can never give you that certainty, right? But anyway, it's kind of funny. He was just kind of like, well, it works anyway. After all of that philosophical rambling, it was like, well, it works anyway. But yeah, I mean, he didn't solve the problem of induction, and no one has since, although Richard Dawkins, in a very famous, not famous, but alhamdulillah, we tried to make it famous, a video, he tried to solve the problem of induction on his own, like, even though he has no philosophical training, and he did a very poor job at it. So yeah, you can have a look at that video as well.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question. Can we assume that the fossil records of Homo erectus, that those fossils are human, or are they some other creature that resembles human beings?
Okay, from a scientific perspective, what the scientists are saying, Homo erectus would be 100%, that would be part of the human story. That's going back, what, 2 million years or whatever. That's just that. From an Islamic perspective, how do we define human? We define human as being Bani Adam. We would not accept Homo erectus as being human. But this is where the point comes in, that there's no scientific basis for us saying that we don't accept it. There's only a philosophical argument we can make, right? So even in my own works, when I say human and I'm using the scientific paradigm, I would be using human from the perspective of including Homo erectus and everything. But do I believe that's the definition of human as a Muslim? No, because I'm sticking with the Quranic definition that Bani Adam is what is human, and everything else is hominid or whatever you want to call it, may resembled humans, or had similar behavior, lived long time ago, slight different anatomical features. Yeah, I mean that's the way I would explain it.
Okay, the next question. Since induction doesn't lead to certainty, can you prove God exists deductively?
I'm not really understanding this question. Since induction doesn't lead to certainty, can you prove God exists deductively? I don't see the link between that. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, can you prove God exists deductively? The thing is, the word proof is a very slippery thing, and we should be careful of proving it. Can we give evidence for God? Yes. Can we give good arguments for God's existence? Yes. Is the evidence of God alive within your own self? Is it true within your fitrah? Is it true within yourself? Yes. Can people deny what's right in front of them? Yes. Right. And it's not that, I mean, it's not the case that a Muslim, the onus is on us to try and show that God exists. In fact, it's the atheist who needs to try and show why we shouldn't believe in God, because the obvious thing that I can assume coming onto this live stream with Newcastle University and the way it's set up with all this, different channels going live stream and comments, the obvious intuitive thing when I come to this is somebody organized this event. I wouldn't say, so what happened is I randomly accidentally got a link, I clicked on it, and I just happened to prepare stuff on evolution, and the poster somebody was making independently, but they just happened to chuck it. Like, this whole event being random would be very ridiculous, right? Well, why would we assume that about, I mean, just today I was looking at, just the way the eye is, subhanallah, just the way the eye is, like, it is so hard to believe that atheism exists. It is so hard to believe that, and then it's, to get more ridiculous, it's harder to believe that they want us to be on the back foot and to give evidence. It's almost like saying, prove to me the world is real. I'm just going to assume it's fake, and I'm going to sit back here and I'm going to fold up my arms, and I want you to give me an argument for the world is real. I would say, well, mate, you can sit there all day. I'm going for a walk. It's you who seriously needs to give me evidence that the world is not real. It's not the other way around.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should be expecting. Yep. So the question here is, if the height of human fossils increases as we go back in time, wouldn't this contradict the modern Darwinian evolution picture where small apes turn into bigger humans?
No, it wouldn't. Because, very good question. You see, if we have organisms becoming bigger over time, and then over time becoming smaller, and then becoming bigger, and then smaller, all of this can fit within Darwinian evolution, because you're just adapting to the environment, right? We have this general idea that evolution means progress, bigger, better, smarter, more complex, more integrated, more networked. No, it's not true. You could be dumber, you could be shorter, you could be fatter, right? I mean, as long as you survive and are adapted to the environment. So yeah, that doesn't really make any sense.
Okay, the next question. Atheism gives faith this definition. One second. Okay, so the definition is, faith is belief without evidence, and since they claim that revelation or the word of Allah is faith-based, how can we counter this?
Well, it's a rubbish definition. Faith is belief without evidence. No, it's not. That's not how we would, I mean, that's definitely not how we would define faith in Islam, Iman in Islam. So yeah, I mean, we would just brush it off as, okay, well, yeah, that's a great argument if your definition is correct, but your definition is wrong.
So how would you define it, brother?
Well, as a Muslim, we would say Iman is based not only on, is definitely not faith without evidence, but what we would say is that it is based upon your the internal truth of Islam, truth of Tawheed, which Allah has put inside you, and also the external world reinforcing that. Yeah. So for us, when we call to Iman, when we call to faith, what tools does Allah tell us to use to call people to Iman, to call people to Islam? Allah doesn't say, pick up a gun, pick up a sword and bring them. Allah doesn't say, trick them. Allah doesn't say, play the flute. Allah says, reason with them. Do you not think? Do you not reflect? Meaning, if we're going to call people to Iman, we want them to use their reason. Yeah. So we would definitely not define faith as being without evidence. And if you do want to define faith as belief without evidence, I would say the vast majority of Darwinists have faith in Darwinism from that definitional point of view, and they don't have evidence. They've been sociologically programmed to accept it. And I've sometimes had discussions with Darwinists who are describing non-Darwinian evolution as Darwinian evolution, and they don't have a clue what they're talking about. It's very hard to correct somebody when they are actually saying something incorrectly, and they are so far in terms of their compounded ignorance, you don't know how to, you don't know how to drain the swamp. you don't know where to begin. So you just sit there and you just smile. Yeah. And sometimes that's the best response.
Right. This is the last question for today. So that concludes the talk, inshallah. To be honest, I'd say, we're very honored to be able to have you today, Brother Subboor. We're honored to, be able to take some of your time out for us. For everybody who's listening, don't forget to tune in tomorrow. Also at 7 p.m. we have another talk scheduled for then, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.